When we ask ourselves whether this is the end of the Ukraine war, we must pause and reflect on the nature of war itself. Wars do not simply end, they evolve, they mutate. They transform into new forms of struggle that often outlast the sound of gunfire. We make a grave mistake when we imagine that war is only measured in the number of tanks destroyed, the territories captured, or the ceasefires declared. The true battleground of war lies in the hearts and minds of people, in the stories they tell themselves, and in the memories that nations choose to preserve. History testifies that wars may conclude on paper, yet continue to live on in the collective psyche for generations. Think of the First World War, which many optimists of that time called the war to end all wars. Yet, barely 2 decades later, humanity was engulfed in a Second World War that dwarfed the first in its scale of destruction. Why? Because the grievances of the defeated, the humiliation, the hunger, and the bitterness were never truly resolved. The ink of treaties could not erase the fire of resentment. The wounds of war are not only physical, they are psychological, and sometimes they are spiritual. They penetrate the soul of nations, and unless they are healed with justice and reconciliation, they fester into new conflicts. So, when we ask whether the Ukraine war is ending, we must not be misled by announcements of negotiations, by the apparent fatigue of soldiers, or by the exhaustion of economies. The silence of weapons does not mean the silence of hostility. The absence of gunfire is not the same as the presence of peace. There is always an illusion at the end of war, the illusion that finality has been achieved, but in reality, what we call the end is often only a pause, an intermission before the next act of conflict begins. Look at the history of Europe itself. For centuries, wars were waged between kingdoms, empires, and nations. The Napoleonic Wars ended with treaties, but they left Europe simmering with unresolved ambitions. The Cold War, which many declared ended in 1991, still casts its long shadow today. Russia, a former superpower stripped of its Soviet empire, continues to define itself not by what it is, but by what it lost. And Ukraine, once bound to Moscow under the Soviet yoke, defines itself by the desire to break free and embrace a different destiny. This is not merely a conflict over land. It is a battle over memory, over history, over identity, and such wars do not end easily. The question then becomes, what does it mean for a war to truly end? Is it when the last soldier leaves the battlefield? Is it when the last city is rebuilt? Or is it when the bitterness in the hearts of men and women is replaced with the courage to forgive and the wisdom to coexist? If we measure the end of war only in military terms, then yes, wars can end abruptly. But if we measure them in terms of human reconciliation, of justice, of dignity restored, then wars outlive the battles that birthed them. Ukraine today is not merely fighting for its borders. It is fighting for its sovereignty, for its right to exist without interference. Russia, on the other hand, is not merely fighting for territory. It is fighting for recognition, for respect, for the restoration of a narrative in which it remains a global power. These struggles are not easily settled at the negotiating table, for they reach beyond politics into the very soul of nations. And when wars touch the soul, their endings become slippery, elusive, and uncertain. We must also remember that wars plant seeds, and those seeds grow even after the battlefield is abandoned. The children who have been displaced, the families who have lost loved ones, the cities reduced to rubble. These do not vanish when the ink dries on an agreement. They become living testaments to what was lost, and they pass that memory to the next generation. Wars end militarily, but they endure emotionally, psychologically, and culturally. A ceasefire can stop the gunfire, but it cannot stop the telling of stories. And the stories people tell about this war will either be stories of pain that fuel revenge, or stories of resilience that fuel reconciliation. That is why we must resist the temptation of simplistic answers. The politician may say, the war is over. The diplomat may declare, peace has been achieved. But the citizen, the villager, the refugee, the orphan, they carry the true verdict of whether a war has ended. And too often their verdict is that the war has only changed form. So is this the end of the Ukraine war? My answer is that it depends on how we define end. If we define it as the cessation of hostilities, perhaps yes, the end is near. But if we define it as the restoration of dignity, the healing of wounds, the reconciliation of adversaries, then the end is still far. For peace is not simply the absence of war. It is the presence of justice, the presence of trust, the presence of a shared vision of the future. When we strip away the layers of propaganda, when we look beyond the smoke of the battlefield, it becomes clear that the Ukraine war is not merely a conflict confined to the borders of Kiev and Moscow. It is a theater, a stage upon which the ambitions of global powers are being rehearsed and displayed. To imagine that this is a local war between two neighbors is to misunderstand its true character. This war is bigger than Ukraine, bigger than Russia. It is a struggle over the future configuration of the global order. Let us consider the players who appear invisible but whose influence is undeniable. NATO, for instance, has found in this conflict both a challenge and an opportunity. For years, there were whispers that NATO had outlived its purpose, that it had become a relic of the Cold War. Yet when Russia moved into Ukraine, NATO found its second wind. Suddenly, the alliance rediscovered unity, relevance, and urgency. The deployment of weapons, the flow of financial aid, the coordination of intelligence, these are not acts of charity. They are acts of strategy. Ukraine, in this sense, is both a victim of aggression and a pawn in a larger chessboard where great powers are testing each other's resolve. Russia, on its part, sees this war not only as a battle for territory, but as a statement against Western dominance. It is not just fighting Ukraine. It is resisting the idea of a world order dictated from Washington, Brussels, or London. To Moscow, Ukraine represents a line in the sand, a frontier where it must assert that its voice still matters, that it is not a fading empire but a player capable of shaping events. And when we listen carefully, we realize that Russia is not merely speaking to Ukraine. It is sending a message to the entire world, that spheres of influence still exist, that history has not ended, and that power remains the ultimate currency in global affairs, but the ripples extend further still. China, watching from a distance, is studying every move with clinical precision. For Beijing, Ukraine is a rehearsal space, a lesson book for its own ambitions in Taiwan and beyond. How the West responds, how Russia withstands sanctions, how alliances hold together, these are not just news headlines for China, they are case studies, blueprints for the geopolitical contests of the future. Turkey, too, has emerged as a fascinating actor. Once dismissed as a minor player, Ankara has skillfully positioned itself as both mediator and power broker, balancing its ties with Russia on one hand and NATO on the other. This is not neutrality born of weakness. It is strategy born of ambition. And then we must not forget India, whose careful balancing act of buying Russian oil while strengthening ties with the West reflects the new reality of multipolar politics. The world is no longer neatly divided into East and West. It is a mosaic of shifting loyalties, pragmatic choices, and calculated moves. The battlefield, therefore, is not only Mariupol, Kherson, or Donetsk. The battlefield is also the oil markets of the Middle East, the grain supplies of Africa, the gas pipelines of Europe, and the stock exchanges of Asia. When a missile lands in Ukraine, its shockwaves are felt in the bread prices of Cairo, the electricity bills of Berlin, and the inflation rates in New Delhi. This is why the Ukraine war cannot be seen as a regional skirmish. It is a global tremor, and every nation, whether directly involved or not, is adjusting its position in response to its aftershocks. This broader lens forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Is the Ukraine war truly about Ukraine, or is Ukraine the stage upon which larger powers are writing their rivalries? Is Ukraine being defended for its own sake, or because it has become the symbol through which NATO seeks to reassert itself and Russia seeks to reimagine itself? If peace were to be declared tomorrow, would the rivalries that fuel this conflict disappear, or would they simply manifest in another theater with another name? This is the danger when wars become proxies for global ambition. Their endings become complicated. For even if Russia and Ukraine were to find common ground, what would that mean for NATO's newfound unity? What would that mean for China's long-term strategies? What would that mean for the balance of power in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia? We are witnessing a war that has transcended geography. It has become symbolic, ideological, and systemic. And wars of this magnitude do not end when soldiers put down their arms. They end only when the global order itself finds a new equilibrium. This is why, when we speak of the end of the Ukraine war, we must not limit ourselves to the physical battlefield. The true contest is not only about who controls Kiev or Crimea. It is about whether the future world will be dominated by one power, by many powers, or by none at all. It is about whether international law will prevail over the law of force, or whether force will once again write the laws by which nations live. Ladies and gentlemen, in every generation there are wars that define the trajectory of history. The Peloponnesian War defined ancient Greece. The Napoleonic Wars defined 19th century Europe. The World Wars defined the 20th century, and the Ukraine War, whether we like it or not, is defining our century. It is exposing the fragility of alliances, the hunger for power, and the global interdependence that no nation can escape. When we speak of war, we often speak of victory and defeat, of gains and losses, of treaties and armistices. Yet, beneath all these lies the most pressing question: what kind of peace will follow? Because history has shown us again and again that peace is never automatic. It is fragile, it is contested, and it demands more courage than war itself. And the tragedy of our age is that we often confuse the silence of guns with the presence of peace. We celebrate the absence of conflict without asking whether justice has been done. But justice, my friends, is the foundation of lasting peace. This is the dilemma at the heart of the Ukraine war. Ukraine seeks not only survival but dignity. It wants its sovereignty restored, its people protected, and its lands reclaimed. Russia, on the other hand, seeks not only territory but recognition. It desires acknowledgement of its influence, its history, and its claim to status as a global power. The West desires stability, the assurance that Europe will not be plunged into perpetual chaos. And the rest of the world, from Africa to Asia to Latin America, desires relief, from food shortages, from economic shocks, from the energy crises that this war has unleashed. But how do you reconcile these competing desires? For peace to exist, someone must compromise. Yet compromise is rarely clean. If Ukraine compromises too much, it may save its people in the short term, but lose its sovereignty in the long term. If Russia compromises too much, it may preserve face diplomatically, but admit weakness strategically. If the West compromises too much, it may secure calm in Europe, but embolden future aggressors elsewhere. Each path has a cost, and the question before us is this: do we want peace, or do we want justice? It is easy to call for peace when you are not the victim. It is easy to call for justice when you are not the aggressor. But in war, the balance between the two becomes almost impossible. Think of post-apartheid South Africa. The country achieved peace by forgiving many who should have faced harsher justice. Think of post-World War Roman II Germany, where peace and justice were intertwined through accountability at Nuremberg. Which model will Ukraine follow? Will it pursue peace at the cost of full justice, or will it pursue justice at the risk of prolonging conflict? This is where the world often stumbles. We celebrate ceasefires, but we do not ask whether they are sustainable. We welcome negotiations, but we fail to ask whether they are honest. A peace that does not address the grievances of the oppressed is but a temporary ceasefire. A peace that ignores accountability is but an invitation for history to repeat itself, and a peace that denies dignity to one side will, sooner or later, collapse under the weight of resentment. Let us be frank. For Ukraine, peace without justice feels like surrender. For Russia, justice without recognition feels like humiliation. For the West, peace without guarantees feels like betrayal, and therein lies the trap. Each side clings to its narrative. Each side insists on its own version of fairness. Yet peace demands more than the victory of one narrative. It demands the courage to create a new narrative altogether. That is why true peace is not only political. It is moral, psychological, and philosophical. It is born not just in treaties signed by leaders, but in the hearts of citizens who choose to live without hatred. And this is the most difficult task of all. For how do you tell a mother who lost her son in battle that she must now forgive? How do you tell a nation whose cities have been reduced to rubble that it must now reconcile with the very hand that destroyed them? How do you tell a people whose sovereignty was violated that compromise is the price of peace? These are not abstract questions. They are the living wounds of Ukraine. And unless the world finds a way to address them, any peace that emerges will be brittle, temporary, and fragile. This is why we must elevate our understanding of the end of war. The end of war is not when armies withdraw. It is when humanity advances. The end of war is not when borders are drawn. It is when trust is rebuilt. The end of war is not when we silence the guns. It is when we silence the hatred that fuels the guns. And this requires a kind of leadership, a kind of moral vision that is rare in our world today. We must recognize that the real test of our time is not whether we can defeat an adversary, but whether we can heal after defeat, after loss, after betrayal. For peace is not the triumph of one side, it is the triumph of humanity itself. And if this war is to end meaningfully, then both peace and justice must walk hand in hand. If one walks without the other, we will return again to the valley of conflict. This war, therefore, challenges not only Ukraine and Russia, but all of us. It forces us to ask, What do we value more, the comfort of stability or the courage of fairness? Do we want a world where peace is merely the quiet imposed by the strong, or a world where peace is the fruit of justice that respects the weak? Our answer to this question will not only decide the fate of Ukraine, it will decide the fate of the 21st century.